I'll say that I'm excited to be here. I'm excited for everyone to join. I hope you find this valuable and informative. And one thing I think you'll understand is it is a new take on how to do process management. And I'll do a fuller introduction in a little bit. So I just wanted to start off with this slide just to set the context. I mean, it only takes a quick scan of the headlines to understand just how important this topic is. So, you could see obviously some big examples. The 2008 financial crash, which really put the entire global economy at risk. There's a lot of organizations such as Enron and Arthur Andersen that just ceased to exist because of risk management failures. And I just wanted to set the context that, spending on risk management is expected to reach $28 billion globally, and that represents a 14% growth rate. So it is a big topic for a lot of organizations. And really failure to be effective in risk management can jeopardize a lot of things from your organization, the environment we live in, your stakeholders, your customers, and then the markets you serve. So I think it's a hugely important, and you guys have probably seen headlines similar to any of these. Um, so what I want to go through is the whole premise of this discussion is that business context is the key to strong risk management. It's not just, looking at risk for risk's sake, but really understanding what your business does as a platform to make sure that you're controlling risk effectively. So there's kind of three sections that I'll go through. One is just a couple quick slides, just talk through what are the challenges in risk management and that organizations face when they're executing a risk management program. Two, how to drive a business integrated risk management program. And then three, how process, and probably a little bit of a jump here, but business context, to me, process is the solution to getting to that business context. So how does process address risk challenges? So a little bit about me. Here's the fuller introduction. So I am a career consultant. I spent 13 years at Accenture, 2 years at Bank of America. And admittedly, those were very technology focused. So I started as a Java C++ programmer. I was a solution architect. I led large development programs. I know what you're probably thinking. Why is he talking about risk? I'll get to that. But then I moved over to Ernst& Young, and they did not have a strong technology practice at the time. But I really got into one of my first engagements was a large bank, and they wanted us to create a business capability model, which was just basically everything that they did on one page, but you could go a couple levels deeper. And that was, to me, an epiphany moment. I'm like, wow, this just seems so powerful because coming from technology, I did not know what the business did. So having that understanding, it just seems so powerful to gain alignment across people. So I really, from that point on, I dedicated myself to the topic, and I started EY's first business architecture practice, and then later it evolved into process excellence. So I led a team of professionals that would go into transformation programs, establish a process capability, and then use that for a whole sort of a whole bunch of activities such as driving strategy, driving a transformation program, designing your IT architecture, leading change, and ultimately risk management. So I spent most of my career in financial services, which obviously you guys know is probably one of the most heavily regulated industries around. So as part of this work and process, I really got involved in how to leverage this as a platform to drive better risk management programs. And then obviously I went to Citibank. I was head of process excellence for the US retail bank, and their context was they had in 2020 they had a $400 million consent order and they stood up a risk transformation program that's still ongoing today, but a lot of what they're doing is based on process. So I leveraged all those experiences. I left Citi in early 23, and I felt compelled to write a book called Digital Transformation Success. And that book really details out my entire process framework and how to build it, how to manage it, and then ultimately how to leverage all this information for really all your transformation needs. And I'll talk through some of those details in a little bit. So if you like what I say, I'm not here to sell a book. I'm here to sell a concept. But if you like the concept and you want to learn more, the book is obviously available on Amazon. And I am also I'm starting my own consulting company called Process Inventory Advisor. So I help clients kind of stand up this capability and then leverage it for value. And then I'm also working with Skills Development Group to roll out a 3-day training class that gets a little bit deeper into some of the concepts that I'll be discussing. Okay, so challenges in risk management. It's good to start with just what's the overall business environment. And obviously, there's external dynamics. The world is changing at it seems like a record pace with interconnected supply chains, globalization, technology advancements with AI, and people trying to figure out what that means. Emerging risks, the competitive landscape. Really, there's a rapidly changing environment that I think all the organizations that we work for are having to figure out. There's been a tremendous amount of growth in regulation. So as you can see from this stat, over the last 60 years, the U.S. population has increased by 98%, but the federal regulatory code has grown by 850 percent. And you guys have probably experienced that in your lives, but there's a massive amount of new regulations that organizations need to understand and comply with. And that certainly raises a lot of challenges. There's a SEC mandate, and this goes back a little bit, but there's an SEC mandate that boards need to have risk oversight. So they have to have someone in there with risk experience, and they have to have a role in understanding what the risk environment is for the organization, which means that they have to have good data that could tell them the landscape so that they could make decisions and execute their oversight function. And then obviously internal complexities. A lot of organizations, especially if you work for a medium or large organization, has grown over the years, and that means silos, that means complicated technologies, that means lack of alignment between leadership and practitioners and across the board. And that certainly becomes a challenge in understanding who does what and how you understand where risk lives and how you control for it. And then this next slide, I just want to talk through my perspectives, and if people want to jump in the chat of if I'm missing anything, I'd love to hear it. But I think here's from my experiences some of the challenges that are holding back risk management programs that is that's really challenging them to produce what's needed. But the first and foremost, I think it's data quality issues. And I found the stat that in one survey, 74% of respondents found that managing reliable data for non-financial risk is a challenge. And I really think it comes down to all organizations, if they have something called a GRC platform, governance, risk and compliance, or just generally a risk repository, there's usually in the core of it is a data model. And that data model is what are my processes, what are my risks, and how do I control for those risks? And the organizations that I've been in, they usually use a generic taxonomy. If people are familiar with APQC's process classification framework, something like that. Well, the challenge is if you're in a multi-business line enterprise that, when they're using this process taxonomy as to do risk assessments, they look at it and they say, okay, the specific business that I'm in, and, when I was a big banking, mortgage looks way different than retail and looks way different than credit card and looks way different than wealth management, et cetera. So when teams on the ground are doing risk assessments, they're trying to match out what they do versus this taxonomy. And there's a lot of interpretation. There's a lot of mapping, which means there's confusion in the data and it's not very clear kind of where risk lives and who has ownership for it. So to me, I think that's the core of the issue. But that leads to quality and management reporting. If you have bad risk data, obviously your leadership, the senior management, the board, they rely on this information to make decisions around products and expansion and transformation and everything that they're looking at. So if you have poor risk data and you roll it up, you're not giving them an accurate view of the organization. And I found this other survey that said 84% of CEOs are concerned about the quality of data they're basing their decisions on. Next is subjective risk assessment. So I'll get into this a little bit, but the core of risk assessments is the risk matrix, which is a likelihood score versus an impact score so that you could determine what are the high risks and you could prioritize what controls you put in there. And that's subject to a lot of human bias, confirmation bias, group bias, et cetera. And then there's also challenges in rolling up risks. If I have five low risks, how many before that chains together does it become a high risk? So there's some of that bias, and I think with technology like AI and advanced analytic tools, you could take some of that out if you have the right structure. And then last is the risk operating model. So I know not every organization uses the three lines of defense model, but whatever model you follow, and I found this other stat that said 50% of organizations face difficulty in identifying the roles and responsibilities between the first and second line. And really, the three lines of defense is the first line is the business. So they own the processes, they own executing controls, and they're closest to the ground, and they need to be aware of what they're responsible for. The second line is the oversight function, and that typically separates out by your risk taxonomy. So you could have a ops risk oversight, you could have a compliance risk oversight, a third party vendor risk management oversight, but they need to look at what risk is doing to understand do they have the right controls? Or are they thinking about priorities right, et cetera? And then the third line is typically internal audit. So, and they report to management, but they also have an independent function where they, in many cases, they report directly to the board. So having confusion in this, and because there's a lot of people in this, is really harmful to be inefficient, making sure that you've captured everything accurate and completely. Oh, sorry, I went the wrong way. Okay, so how to drive business integrated risk management. So really, I define business integrated risk management as a holistic approach to managing risk that aligns risk management processes to the organization's overall business strategy and operations. And I kind of broke it out in two parts. There's the business side, and I kind of pointed to this ISO 31000 definition, which is risk is the effect and uncertainty on objectives. And I think that's an important phrase because it's objective, but you reach your objectives by taking action, i.e. process. So, and then getting, and if you could get that business alignment as part of this, that enables all alignment from your strategy to your execution and all across the board where everyone knows their roles and responsibilities and everything is put in context of what the business does, which is ultimately the key. And then integrated. So you should have one view of all your risks that roll up to the organization that looks across the enterprise and really provides all that valuable data to the leadership and board of what is my risk environment? Do I need to address any shortcomings? Or what does it mean for my plans for the future? So ultimately the punchline to that is you need a strong information architecture that connects all the dots. And I show this diagram because I think it's a great visual that if you think about process, it's really your ground truth for understanding everything that an organization does. So if you have your processes may connect with customers if they're external facing. They likely connect with applications in your enterprise architecture. They may serve channels and purposes, products and channels. There's obviously people associated with it. So if you could get an understanding of your process environment, you could start connecting all these dots. And that's ultimately in these complex organizations that we work in, there's a lot of dots. Everything's interconnected and interdependent. And understanding those relationships is really the key to being strong. So a lot of what I'll talk about in this section is how do you construct this model so that you make process your ground truth for everything you do from a risk perspective. Um, so, oh, I meant to take the automation off. So really what you need is a process inventory or a full process taxonomy that describes everything you do. And there's a couple things that is important, and that gives you traceability, that aligns to your activities of the business. But really, there's a couple things that are important. It has to be comprehensive. So if you have to capture every process that happens within each organization, because when you're doing that risk assessment, no matter how insignificant a process may be, it can incur risk that is maybe unacceptable to the organization. So being comprehensive gives you a complete map to do full risk assessments. It has to represent different levels of granularity. So it's got to be useful for those defining strategy at maybe the C level to those implementing and executing controls at the root level. But it's all got to be connected so that everyone's speaking from the same sheet of music. It's got to enable cross-functional collaboration. So we'll talk through some of this a bit later, but there's a lot, not only just the risk organization, but there's technology and business, and there's a lot of people that play a role in managing risk, and having transparency of what everyone does is so critical. It should capture the clear ownership and accountability. I was in some organizations where we extract the controls out of the risk repository and there's no owner identified. So you're trying to figure out, okay, like who's accountable for executing this control? Where does it even align to the processes that are executed in the environment? And that's a big problem because you could have, as I mentioned, the data issue. You could have a lot of control information in your risk repository that no one's looking at, no one cares about, no one's taking ownership of. So you really have got to drive clear ownership and enable standardization across similar processes. And in this diagram on the right, you see kind of on the left-hand side, you see a breakdown of your organization from the top and the business units and all the processes. And those dots just represent process groups or processes, and you could understand what everyone does. But there's also a case to be made that you need to understand where there's like processes across organizations. So in this diagram, one business calls it an open account, another business calls it onboard client, another one calls it set up customer. I like to use the terminology that they use because they have to take ownership. But if I could use a standard model like your APQC process classification framework or a business capability model, now you could do some mapping. Now you could understand, oh, those are all really account opening type processes. And now I want to drive standard controls. And maybe even it goes beyond, I want to implement similar technologies or similar procedures. You could really drive standardization across different functions. And then the last part of this is align with key operational data. So if you know your processes, you could align this to what applications they utilize, what risks and controls they're responsible for, what third-party vendors. I mean, the list goes on and on. It's really tying everything together in one model where you could slice and dice and understand the impacts of everything. So how do you construct it to be comprehensive and everything that I mentioned? Is you've got to follow the organizational hierarchy. So to be comprehensive, you need to follow something that is comprehensive, which is your organizational hierarchy. So what you do is you essentially do an interview process. And you could obviously there's a research angle part of this too, where you read procedures and really trying to leverage every material to build a draft. But ultimately, you need to go to each leader and say, what is it your organization does? And then you go to their teams and what is it you do? And you go to their teams and what is it that you do? Until you feel like you're at the level of process that's adequate for your needs. I'm a big believer in attestations, and you do that bottom up. Do you agree that this is accurate and complete? Get a formal email or some electronic attestation that says, yes, this is good. You go to their leadership. Do you agree with the structure, accurate and complete? Yes, I get an attestation. I keep going up. Now everyone's joining hands and saying, okay, this is the truth about what this organization does from a process perspective. And now you could use that as a foundation. One question that I always get when I represent this slide, and I'll just preempt it now, is, okay, but my organization changes all the time, and changes is a constant in organizations. I'm sure you guys will attest. So that, and I have a slide that I'll speak to a little bit later, but you really need some strong governance around this, and that takes the form of in two ways. One is you need a periodic attestation. You could determine if it's 6 months or a year, but you have to have teams that go out to the business and say, is this still accurate and complete? Let me adjust it based on the changes. But quality and accuracy is paramount when doing something like this. And then the second big way is really understanding, or is really integrating this process information really is everything you do in the organization so that people come to rely on it. And it's less of a pull to get the information to make it accurate and complete, but people are pushing. And how that manifests in a risk management program is you have before you do a risk assessment, the risk team should say, "Hey, process capability or COE, can you work with the business really quick and just validate that this is accurate and complete?" They go through their exercise, they get their attestations. Now the risk assessment teams have a great process platform or business context to drive all their risk assessments. All right. So I just want to speak a little bit about, I talk about process, but really in the world of process, there's not just one model that covers everything that the organization does. There's a lot of different model types. So a good way to think about this is you want to take all the best of these models and the different levels of granularity and the purposes that they serve and think through what's important for your organization, but ultimately all the dots need to connect so that you have one unified model that describes your organization at different levels of granularity, and you could slice and dice it. The core of this is really the what, which I'll point to with my mouse if you guys could see it. But that's the process inventory, which is what does each of my organizations do and perform? And then your capability model or your process classification framework, which is what's my organizationally agnostic model so that I can map like processes and drive standardizations. Now, once you have that process inventory, you could drive down to a level deeper and say, how do those processes work? So that means creating BPMN 2.0 process maps where I could understand the starting event, the ending event, all the activities, and how technology and people and third parties and everything, how that's implemented. And then there's a layer below, which is the process metadata. So taking your data within your organization and performing the association so that you know full impacts across everything that you're assessing or maybe even changing. And then if I go up from there, there's end-to-end view. So if you take an organizationally aligned process inventory, a process may end of one process may hand over to another organization to finish another step. It may hand over to another organization. I may need to know that full end to end, either from an external customer perspective, which is your journey, so an outside in view, or an internal perspective. So from a concept through delivering value, which is the value stream. And
Hey,
then
Michael,
ultimately, yes,
can I interrupt you for a quick question?
please.
So, we have an anonymous question that came through. It says, our processes are changing on almost a weekly basis, if not daily. How can we build a bottom-up process attestation in such a state of flux?
That's interesting. I'd love to hear the context of the changes, but I think you could certainly still start top down in understanding the areas of the processes. I suspect in that maybe the how changes, but not the what. And I think that having names of processes is sufficient enough to do risk assessments because you could take a definition and say, I know what they're doing. I don't need to see the details. And you could still understand what risk does this incur and how do we control it. But that's a great question. Love to get with that person offline to understand the context but yeah, I think it's the concept is still important to understand your process. It's just how frequently, what's the trigger for your changes and then what's your governance process to make sure that it remains accurate. Yeah, that's an excellent question, by the way.
Right. They say that's true. The how changes, not the what. Thank you. So,
Perfect.
thank you.
Perfect. Ah, I nailed it. Okay, I want to advance my slide. There you go. Okay. So, so really, and I kind of mentioned this with metadata, but to really understand everything that your organization does and connect the dots and really get to system thinking, which is important, is your organization probably has data about operations in a bunch of operational data repositories that aren't connected, that don't use kind of the same index or common key across. So what is important is to take a business process analysis tool, and there's a bunch of them on the market. Software AG, Eris, GB Tech, BIC, Signavio. There's a bunch of them. But you take all this information and you build it into your process analysis or documentation tool, and you construct libraries. And when you're creating your process inventory and your process models, you could take the information from those repositories and associate it with your process. So that, and there's an example at the bottom where I have a system repository and it's got system ID, system name, et cetera. But I take that information, I build it into a system library, and then when I build a process flow and I have an activity called send quote, now I could associate that happens to happen on the credit request system. So building that association gives you the ability to slice and dice the information, the environment, and understand the impacts across everything. And that's really key for connecting stakeholders, and I'll get into some resilience, but there's a lot of implications and benefits for doing something like this. Um, and lastly, I already kind of talked about this with the governance, but what this talks about, if you're going to create this information, you have to maintain it. You have to govern the quality, everything. That means that you've got to create a process capability, and it doesn't need to necessarily be a large team, depending on the level of depth you're going to, the amount of process modeling you're creating, but a team that is responsible for this. And typically call it a process center of excellence. But a couple key things that are needed is you need center of excellence leadership that is really committed to this cause and has that eye for quality and understands that they've got to document the environment and lead their team in a way that's useful for risk management. There's modelers. So these are teams of people that go engage with the business, do the interviews that I mentioned, create the taxonomies, validate quality, and make sure that everything is appropriate. Demand management, obviously, there's a lot going on. Maintaining process standards, and that's important. So, you'll see in a lot of my examples, for instance, process names are verb noun because it is an action, which is the verb, and typically it happens on something. So that's a standard terminology that I use. But there's a lot of standards that you could get into, especially if you're going into process modeling and capability mapping and everything that I showed in the other way, in the other slide. Governance of process assets I mentioned, and then managing the data and platform. So that platform I mentioned on the previous slide, it's a fairly intense data integration effort, and you've got to maintain this data and uh, generate reports and do impact analysis and everything. So it's a pretty important function that I think needs to live if you're going to take this business integrated risk management approach. Organizations need to invest the money and resources into this and really commit to this as a key part of their solution. And then last slide, this starts to step outside of just core risk management, but I wanted to show this just to kind of increase the aperture of what process inventory could mean. So if you have a strong process inventory, it is useful for really everything that you could do from a transformation or an operational excellence standpoint. So these are kind of the big 6 use cases that I've defined and all detailed in my book. But the first one is strategy to impact, understanding how the C-level defines their strategy, and then understanding the impacts so that you could make appropriate resource allocation decisions and investment decisions. And you could do heat maps to guide some of that decision making. If your organization's executing a transformation program, this does everything from helping you define what your transformation strategy is and get clear around the impacts, as I mentioned. But you could also create your roadmap and manage the journey all through this common lens of the business, which is process. Everything from a change management perspective. So if I understand what I need to change, I could create clear project charters which define my scope in terms of what are my impacted processes. I could think through my new target operating model, which helps me consider the people, process, technology, third party, all the impacts for what I'm changing into. I could develop requirements. So if I have an inventory of processes and I know that process is changing, I could hang my business requirements, my technical requirements, et cetera, off those processes so that I have traceability into my business context. Creating designs, identifying controls. So I don't have a slide in here about this, but it's really shifting left in that whole change process so that you're engaging the risk teams, the first line teams in that requirements and design process so that they're considering what you're building, what risks are inherent in that, and making sure that you design controls right up front. But everything testing, the people change management procedures, job aids, training, getting alignment of what processes people perform and what's expected of them. Operational excellence. So this is all about, you're probably familiar with Lean Six Sigma, but it's Lean Six Sigma is taking a process or a group of processes and looking for the inefficiencies and driving out waste. Well, this structure, because it maps to like the top level of an organization, allows you to look for inefficiencies and waste at a top level. Like, why do I have 5 ERP platforms? And maybe you already know that, but it could give you those instances where you could look at a strategy level and say, how can we get more efficient from a cost, increase quality, or whatever your measure that you're targeting. And then last, enterprise architecture. So if you were to give enterprise architecture teams more details about what the business does, more business context, then they could define an IT architecture that's more aligned to the business's needs and is agile in the face of future change. So let me pause there. Any questions before I move on to the next section? All right, if not, I'll move on. So how does this concept of process aid in addressing risk challenges? So first off, and I led with my thoughts that I think risk data is the core of risk management challenges. So in this concept, now you take and I mentioned in a lot of cases the anchor for that is a generic taxonomy that doesn't describe all the businesses uniquely, but is kind of generic for the organization. Now, if you were to create this full process inventory with all the process names, the owners, et cetera, now you could use that as an anchor for your GRC data model. And then that traces to every process and every business context that your organization does. So you could see, processes directly tied to risk, then tied to controls and how you monitor it. It's a way to map the laws, policies to the regulatory obligations, and then what processes are responsible for it. It's a way to map third-party vendors and how do they integrate with the processes in the organization, issues, and then risk assessments and events from a business continuity, operational resiliency perspective. It really gives you that solid business context foundation to make sure that everything is clear, everything is traceable, and that you have high quality risk data. So and then on the left, just a few points. So really, this helps you manage every type of risk, and I just put some examples in here. Financial risk, and I'll admit, is maybe a little bit of a stretch because financial risk is really about good quality data. Do you know the lineage of the data? Are the calculations right, et cetera? But there is a tie to how you do that. Compliance risk. So where are my regulatory obligations and how do I comply with those? Op risk, which is really what is it that I do in the course of doing business, and do any of those activities incur unacceptable risks that I need to control for? Third-party vendor risk managers is really understanding the landscape of your third parties and what they do for you, and then maybe they support applications that you use, or maybe it's a full outsourcing and outsourcing. And I've worked with a lot of outsourcers where organizations almost wipe their hands saying, "Oh, now it's with them." But I think it's the important frame is to think about is that you still own that functionality. If your third party vendor does something wrong, the regulators or whoever is going to come after you because you still have ownership of that. So you really have to understand what it is your vendors are doing, and are they being appropriate in their risk management exercises. And you could scan the news, and there's been a lot of instances where third parties didn't have controls on data, and personal identifiable information got leaked out that shouldn't have. So it's really the onus is on the organization to understand that. IT and security risk management, understanding where there's risk in that environment, And then product risk management, which I've seen a lot of organizations try and get to, but it's a struggle, which is if you can map your processes to the products that they support, and if you could do your risk assessments, create risk ratings, define your controls at the process perspective, then you could aggregate all the processes that support products, and then you could understand the risk rating for your products, and then obviously make the appropriate decisions to control risk from that perspective. But it also becomes a single kind of business context or single language for doing audit management and management reporting. So doing roll-ups that make sense and get quality information to leadership. Policy and document management. So you could all, and I kind of mentioned procedures too, but understanding every process, its risk profile, and make sure that the procedures align to the controls that are appropriate for that process. Um, Performance and monitoring metrics. So really identifying, monitoring this whole thing to make sure that people are doing what they need to do and that controls are working as effective. Um, and yeah, I'll get to it in this slide. Yeah. So another issue that I mentioned is the risk operating model, and I put an example in here for a banking, retail branch banking, and I'll admit, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of my experience is in financial services, so I'm probably biased towards banking examples, but really this I think is important for any business that where risk is a big agenda. But if you have your full kind of taxonomy of processes, that becomes a single kind of business context for all risk types to do mapping to. And you could see I mapped an example of an ops risk and a compliance risk and where business continuity is important. Really, and that can get you to an integrated risk assessment where everyone's looking at the same what the business does, and then everything maps to accountability from a process ownership in the business and really helps you drive quality. Gets you that comprehensive business understanding. It gets you clear accountability. And then one thing I want to mention, which is the last bullet, which is enhance productive capabilities. And I did mention that a lot of risk assessments are created on risk matrices, which has a lot of human biases and other challenges that I mentioned earlier. Well, with the advent of AI, and if you give AI, and there's even the concept of digital twin, but if you give it a good map of the world and you align controls to it, now it could start analyzing, doing maybe Monte Carlo simulations or proper roll-ups where you're calculating, does five low risk create equal a medium or does it equal a high? It could start to do some of that calculations. It could do predictive analytics and really be another support tool for driving better risk assessments and better controls. Oh, sorry, I went the wrong way. And then I might be going a little bit faster, but this is good. We could leave a lot of time for questions. But I put two examples in here, which I think are pretty important. But I could talk about all the different risk types. But regulatory compliance, which is really to me a big data mapping exercise. Granted, it's extremely complicated, but at the first you have what are the rules? So you have laws or regulatory agencies, you have standards like GAAP, industry standards, et cetera. You need to understand what the full landscape of those things are, and then what are the statutes or rules within there, and then how do those apply to your organization, which is what are your obligations? And typically that is maybe the legal and compliance teams, which are looking at those rules and saying, this is what it means for us and what our obligation is. But if you could take those obligations and map it to process, now you have a clear understanding of where do we have to comply with each of these rules or obligations. And then now you could work with the first line, second line team to say, okay, what is the appropriate control? But that becomes kind of a single map and of where all your obligations are. And I think, and I've seen a lot of organizations that maybe struggle with their regulatory engagement. This makes everything transparent that you could even, share with the regulators and say, did I get these obligations right? And here's where all my processes are, and here's my controls, and here's how I'm reporting the health of my control environment, and really make it more of a two-way conversation where you could really get better in that. And one thing I didn't mention at the outset, but if you scan the headlines, there's a lot of regulatory action. So consent orders or material remediations, et cetera, that need to be addressed. And if you could kind of improve the understanding between what you do as a business and what the regulators are looking at, I really think it'll help the environment significantly. And then the last example is operational resilience, which I think is a massive data mapping exercise. We talked about connecting all the dots, but with we'll just start with a definition. So operational resiliency is the ability for an organization to maintain critical business processes, or sometimes it's mentioned as external services, but to me it's the same thing. It's what action your organization does and just which ones are externally facing that in the event um, of a disruptive event like a hurricane, a natural disaster, political strife, pandemics, you name it, what are the critical processes that must maintain minimum level of operations? How do I control for that? So I need to build in resiliency from my IT environment, make sure things are fault redundant and there's geographically diversity in data centers and all the things that you need to do from an IT perspective. You need third party. You need to understand your role in third parties. And I failed to mention this. There's an increasing amount of regulations, and I point to the Digital Operational Resiliency Act in the EU, which is mandating a certain level of requirements for what operational resiliency needs to look like. And they are requiring proof that you've mapped out where all your processes are, what are the critical ones. Are you doing appropriate testing? Do you have business continuity plans when these things occur? Do you know, and that's another big thing is they put the responsibility in the organization to understand what is it your third parties do? Are they implementing strong resiliency frameworks? Do they have the right controls? Do they understand what's important? Are they building an IT resiliency, et cetera? And then also, I read one of these articles that said that the regulators are demanding that business leaders are directly engaged to identify critical processes. So they want to take it out of just exclusively the risk realm and make sure that the business is weighing in that, if there's a hurricane. And by the way, one story I did back in my consulting days, and this is after the event, but I was brought in one insurance company that did property and casualty risk. They had their claim system. So when their claim systems exclusively in Texas data centers, and this is a few years back. And if you guys remember the Texas ice storms that blew out the entire power grid, well, since their claims applications were exclusively in Texas, the point at which their customers needed them the most, which is, hey, I'm experiencing a lot of loss from this event. I need to file a claim. Their claim systems were down. So agents were having to literally take notes in a notepad and then make sure that they put those into the system when that came up. So they certainly wanted to take an approach like this so they could understand, okay, claims is a critical process for me. In an event of an emergency, I need to make sure my customers can make a claim. So business leaders can make that identification, and then they can work with technology and risk to say, oh, these are all in one geographic location. Let's make sure it's distributed. So that's just a good example. But a lot of organizations, when they're executing these, they lack visibility. So there's just not good documentation of all the different components back to the systems thinking that are in the environment. What's the connections? What are the interdependencies? And really getting this understanding leads to effective collaboration. So you can see everybody's looking at the same ground truth of what the organization does, and they could collaborate in a clear and clean way to understand how everything works and what their mitigating controls and after event activities need to be.
Michael, we have a question.
Please.
John asks, what is the best starting point? This is a lot, and my organization and leaders know they need this, but it seems to be so much. So, how can we start in a way people won't fear the journey ahead?
That is an excellent question. So a lot of what I do in my consulting practice is I always start with a bit of a strategy, and it doesn't have to be a heavy thing. But I mentioned that bubble diagram of all things that process can be. I would first start out with defining a strategy, which is what is important for you. How do you want to use this concept to add value? What use cases do you, and that's that six bubble diagram. What use cases do you want to have an impact on, and what metrics you want to start with? Then you could define a charter, define your frameworks, the people side of it, really get organized around what does this process capability look like. And then I would start with probably something small. Just take, and this may sound like and it probably does, a big, large undertaking. But if you really think about it, your business, and if you look from an organizational hierarchy perspective, are a lot of different organizational units. So you could just do a pilot in one, maybe critical business area or easy business area, and do your process inventory, and then work with your risk management teams to start to change how they do risk assessments, how they report on the health of controls, and really, um, you know, start to build momentum in a show, not tell way. So, um, certainly happy to get with you offline, and I could certainly go into a lot more details on how to do this in not a scary way. But it's really important, and I think you could do it in small chunks that get you wins along the way. Excellent. And then I'll close with this, and then we could end with questions. So I always state this, and this is a kind of generic business case, but and I mentioned you could do this small and scale and really kind of drive excellence in everything that the organization does. This does require organizational commitment and investment to do, which means you've got to invest for this in the long term. You've got to have the right mindset and know that this is the core of what you're doing. But as I mentioned earlier, the cost of regulatory changes, the cost of fines and regulatory actions and customer issues and everything is a big cost. And I think when you weigh the cost of the failures of risk management versus the cost of doing this, you'll realize that the cost of doing this is a small fraction. Really think about it as getting your house in order. So, organizations have a decision to make. Either they do it or they don't do it, but they will pay either way. This is the only question is, do you want to pay up front, or do you want to pay on the back end with the cost of all the failures that are in your environment? So that's all I had for my prepared remarks. Any questions? Love to hear what you guys think.
Great. Thanks so much. What a wonderful presentation. I hope that all of you are getting a lot out of this. We do have one question from Samuel. He says, regarding your process operating model, appreciate any thoughts you could also share on incorporating aspects of COBIT, governance and strategic goals, and ITIL framework, guiding principles and continual improvement to also help to achieve proper organization alignment to manage risk.
Absolutely great question. So COBIT and ITIL are really all about their frameworks for identifying your processes and your actions within your IT operations. And I think that those are kind of forms of process inventory. And you could take this concept and map out everything that you do from a process inventory perspective, from an IT operations perspective. And then you could do all your COBIT controls, you could do all your controls from everything so that you are executing your IT operations efficiently and you're implementing the right controls. From a strategy perspective, absolutely, and I think that's one of the core use cases. If my leadership at the C level or whatever is defining my strategy, I want to be able to map that precisely to the processes that are impacted by it, so that I'm creating my project portfolio, so I'm objectively directing funding to the right projects, and I'm aligning my objectives and the measures for how I have to perform that function to it. So I think that's an excellent case, and this is very much appropriate for it.
Great. Thank you. I see Joseph has raised his hand. If you have a question, if you could put it in the chat, please. I don't know if I can unmic you at the moment, but would love to see if you have a question. Anyone else have questions for Michael or thoughts, comments, ideas? Has this sparked any kind of aha moment or um, overwhelm moment, perhaps?
Or maybe you think I'm just off base. Like,
Yeah, please. Well, feel free to share any thoughts around any of these ideas. I'm just checking the Q&A. I don't see anything there. Um, Michael, do you have any other closing thoughts to share?
I like Anna. She might start doing a process inventory in my life. I think that's a good thing. How I manage my
Oh,
household. That's my next project. No,
okay.
I think thanks for having me. If you guys, I'm on LinkedIn. Please connect with me. And if you guys want to know more, I'm happy to set up time with you and just talk through this concept, how to start a process capability, really everything that comes along with this. I am obviously very passionate about this topic and happy to share with anyone and everyone.
Great. Well, thank you so much. We appreciate having you, Michael. And for those of you that enjoyed the presentation, he'll be back on October 9th. So please do check out that webinar that's coming up. And he's also one of our speakers at Gen AI Day, which is coming up October 30th. So I'll send out a link for those two events. Okay, great. See you on October 9th, John. And thank you all for the comments. Please do send us feedback. We always love to hear from you. And with that, I will wish everyone a wonderful afternoon. Thank you so much for being here. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.